Now that we've looked at how to achieve a well-balanced and clean mix, the next thing we're going to focus on is stereo width, which is one of the main factors in determining how large a mix sounds, alongside depth, which we'll also be covering. Adjusting the stereo image of a sound can also help to clean up a mix by simply moving things out of the center, so not everything's bunched up there. Before we get into all of that though, it's probably a good idea to have an explanation on what stereo actually means, in case there's any confusion going on in this regard. So to demonstrate the difference between mono and stereo then, I've just dragged in a few different samples here from LoopCloud. And LoopCloud's a great app for finding mono and stereo samples because you can see I've done two separate searches here on these two tabs, both for vocal samples. So I just added the vocal tab to the search up the top here. But on the first one, I've gone over to the sidebar and I've brought down the stereo width. So it's all the way to the bottom. So it's just mono. So this is now searching for mono samples. And on this tab, I've done the same, but I've brought the minimum amount at the bottom here all the way up to the top. So now we're purely searching for really ultra wide samples. And on the first search tab here, you can see if I click on some of these samples that probably the majority of them have just a single image down here, so just a single waveform. Whereas when I click on some of the others here, like this one, there are two. Now, when we have a single one, this means it's a single channel sound. So whenever you see a single waveform, you know straight away it's a mono sound. Often you get this with vocals or with certain instruments because they've generally been recorded using a single microphone. And for that reason, they end up being mono, so single channel. But it gets a little bit confusing perhaps when you start to see two channels here. You might think, oh, well, that's a stereo sample, and it is a stereo sample because there's two channels, but it's actually in mono. And I'll show you the difference in a minute when we go over to live. So what I've done is I've imported two of these different mono samples, one that's stereo and one that's mono, so I can show you the difference between those in the DAW. And I've also dragged in a couple of ultra wide stereo samples as well. So let's jump over to live. So playing this first one then, this is definitely a mono vocal.
I've been holding something back that maybe you should know.
And then we've got this second one here, which is stereo with the two channels here, but also mono. And the way that you can tell this one's mono as well, there are two ways. One is much subtler than the other. Firstly, these waveform images, these waveforms above and below here are identical. And if I was to zoom in, you'll be able to see more clearly that they're exactly the same waveform. So that's the first way that you can tell. Now the second one is a bit more obvious, and it's if you play it and actually look at the meter. The left and right channel are doing exactly the same thing. So you're not seeing any differences to the left and right channel on the meters. So that's a mono sound. Now, obviously, if you are listening on headphones or you have two speakers, you're on a mono stereo setup, you should also be able to hear potentially that there's no width. But if you're totally new to it, maybe that's something you can't quite detect at this stage. But you'll hopefully hear the very large difference if I go from this sample here to this next one, which is an ultra wide. So loads of differences there between the left and right, and hopefully you can hear it just really kind of spreads out wide. So you can see the meters doing very different things there. clearly a very stereo sample. And then another one here. So yeah, also really, really wide. And yeah, if we just check out the sample by zooming in, you can see with this one, although the waveforms are quite similar, you can see they're staggered. So this one is happening earlier than this one. So a clear and distinct difference going on there. And with this second waveform, sometimes the waveforms are clearly kind of different sizes. You can see here and here, for example. And other times, there's a more obvious kind of time difference where this one's occurring a little bit later than this one. So quite a few different changes to the waveform that you can see fairly clearly even when you're sort of zoomed out there. So yeah, those are the sort of ways of identifying it kind of visually and also how it sounds. But there's another way of checking visually whether something's mono or not, or how much stereo information it has. And that's to use a stereo meter such as Ozone Imager 2. This is a free plugin. And there are various other ones that you get. Often you don't have this sort of thing included in a DAW's factory suite for some reason. But yeah, fortunately you have free plugins like this one available. And if I listen to the first sample now, which we know is definitely mono, let's check out how it looks on the meter.
I've been holding something back then.
So you can see it's just a straight line here in the middle. Essentially, this is the stereo field from extreme left or completely left to completely right.
I've been holding.
And you can see it's just a line going right down the middle. So that's what a mono sample looks like on one of these meters. So we can check out this one just to prove that this one is mono as well. And now if we listen to these next two, crazy amounts of stereo information going on, filling up the whole field. And the next one as well. So that's showing you, the difference between these, extreme ends of the stereo width spectrum. Two samples that are completely mono, showing us a straight line down the center, and then two ultra wide ones, practically filling up the entire meter. So now that we've run through the differences, let's check out the sounds that are going on in our mix. So just like when we checked out the frequencies in sounds earlier on, I'm going to do a similar thing to check out the stereo information in our sounds by adding to our master channel Imager 2, and then literally just turning on different sounds one by one. So I'll select all of them here and turn them off. And then just bring in various sounds whilst looking at the meter to see the differences here. So here's our kick. So it's mostly focused in the center there, but there is some width to it. As you see, just that line is a little bit thicker than it was before. And it's actually got all these kind of dots scattered about as well. So there's some stereo information going on our kick, which we might not want, but we'll come on to that a bit later on. Let's just check out some other sounds here, like the bass. The bass is completely mono then. That's most likely been recorded with an amp or possibly even using a line input, so a single cable going into an interface or wherever it's been recorded. So completely mono sample there. And by the way, you can probably see a lot of these samples appear to be stereo as well when you first see them. And that's actually because I imported them from Loop Cloud using the export function, which has exported them as stereo, even though they might still be mono sounds. So let's keep working through some of them. So the bass is mono. Keys also mono, so that's an example of a sound that we're almost certainly going to want to add a fair bit of width to. Guitar looks mono as well, I think. Pad. Tons of width there, and that's fine for that kind of a sound. The vocal.
You gotta get down on the dance floor.
Mono, which is good. And FX probably also a ton of width. So you can see it there. Starts off nice and wide, but gets wider and wider, and it pushed right out to the sides at the end there. But yeah, you can see how these meters are really useful in showing you exactly what's going on with all of your sounds. So that was an example of how to identify mono and stereo sounds in a project. And just to recap, especially on how sounds can be mono and stereo, because I can see how that can be a bit confusing. Although it's easy to see that this sample is mono, as it's a single channel source here with a single waveform, in this case, a vocal that's been recorded with a single microphone. Even this sample here is being converted into stereo by Ableton, because as my audio output, I have a stereo source selected. That's a 2-channel source with outputs 1 and 2. In this case, a stereo interface that has a pair of speakers or pair of headphones connected to it that have a left and a right channel. So in order to convert a mono sound like this one to stereo, you simply have to send this single channel to both sides of the stereo field. So you replicate this single channel and you send this identical signal to both the left and right channels of the stereo mix. And because that results in an identical signal on both the left and right sides, it means that that sound has no what's called stereo or side information, which means that the sound ends up being positioned dead center in the stereo field or right in the middle of the mix. So for example, with these sounds here in the mix, like the guitar and the pad, the guitar, like many of the other sounds as we heard and saw, although it appears to be a stereo sample in that it clearly has a left and a right channel here on the track, because these signals are actually a mono sound that's been imprinted identically on the left and right, once again, the signal's identical on both sides, there's no stereo information, and that guitar ends up being located dead center, just like other mono sounds. Whereas the pad here, you can clearly see, even when zoomed out, just how different the signal in the left and right are. And this means there's going to be a lot of stereo information, which is going to result in the sound having a lot of width. So not being located in one position in the mix, like dead center, or let's say closer to one speaker or the other, so located in one other definite position in the stereo field, but in fact spread across the entire field or filling the whole mix, you could say. So this is yet another reason why this pad is such a kind of domineering sample, in that it's quite loud, it's fully sustained, doesn't have much dynamic range, it's just kind of consistently loud. It has loud frequencies, a lot of mid frequencies and ones the ear is sensitive to, so it's kind of a noisy sample as well. And on top of all that, it's also got a lot of stereo information, so it's kind of filling up the whole mix as well. So it's for all these reasons that when you bring a sample like this into your mix, you have to really treat it quite carefully if you're going to make it fit. And we've already looked at that with regards to setting the level carefully when you're balancing, using EQ quite harshly, in fact, to tame a lot of those frequencies. But you might also want to consider the width and treating that in some way too. So we'll kind of get to that in a bit. First of all, we're going to start with some slightly simpler ways to add width to your mix or change the stereo image of sounds, and that's by looking at panning.